Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. I'm just going to run through a few quick items of housekeeping while we wait for other people to join. We're really excited to see you all here tonight for our alternate currents panel discussion. Tonight's topic is charity or solidarity, philanthropy and cultural institutions, with panelists Rebecca Carew, Alex O'Hanlon, Caitlin Osborn, and our moderator Lillian Snortland. We want to thank the Pate Family Foundation and the Nebraska Arts Council and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, whose support makes programs like these possible. My name is Peter. I'm the program director here at Amplify Arts. For anybody here tonight who's new to Amplify, our mission is to support unity, progress, and innovation in the cultural sector. And Alternate Currents is a program that helps us do that by providing some context for national and international conversations in the arts, with responses from people working on the ground level. The program does that in a few different ways. The Alternate Currents blog, this bi-monthly conversation series that we're all participating in tonight, and a working group of 10 artists and organizers who meet every month to develop project-based responses, all come together to kind of move these conversations from discussion to action. Lily, our moderator tonight, is a member of our 2021 Alternate Currents Working Group. And this discussion really is part of a year-long investigation of the future of our cultural institutions and how that future might be shaped by embracing equity, transparency, and accountability. Our panelists are going to be talking to each other for probably about 40 or 45 minutes before we open the floor to questions. At that point, please feel free to enter your thoughts or questions into the Q&A or the chat if you'd rather use the chat function. I also want to mention that a video and transcript of tonight's discussion with links to additional articles and resources will be posted to the Alternate Currents blog in the next week or two. So you can revisit the conversation there, leave your thoughts in the comment section, and help us keep these conversations going. Go to our website anytime, amplifyarts.org, and click on the Alternate Currents tab to read, watch, or listen to tonight's discussion again, or more discussions like this. So I'm really excited for tonight, our discussion, and to learn from Rebecca, Alex, Caitlin, and Lily. So thank you everybody again for being here. And Lily, I will pass it off to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all the panelists. I mean, Peter pretty much covered all the front end stuff. So I figured we could just dive into personal introductions. I guess I can go first. My name's Lillian. I live in Baltimore right now. I'm a writer, a multidisciplinary artist, and I primarily work in the nonprofit arts sector in the development world. So this is a panel that I'm really excited to get to listen in on and ask questions about. Alex, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. My name is Alex O'Hanlon. I live in Omaha. Currently, I work at One Omaha as an engagement coordinator. So One Omaha supports like neighborhood organizers, and I'm kind of like that front line of interacting with those folks. Also do a lot of work around like produce and like growing food in the city. And yeah, so definitely like kind of live in that nonprofit world and love it and hate it all at the same time. So yeah, also excited about tonight.
Rebecca, do you want to go?
Sure. My name is Rebecca Carew. I work in corporate fundraising, also in the nonprofit sector. I've worked in nonprofit arts and culture for about 15 years in a variety of institutions, including museums and the performing arts. I'm personally very passionate about visual art. I'm a burgeoning collector, and I'm very excited to be here.
Guess that leaves me. I'm Caitlin Osborn. I'm the deputy director here at Amplify. Been here for about 5 years almost, and do a variety of things as deputy, but I've been a part of development and fundraising in all capacities during my time here, from grant writing to running annual campaigns. So yeah, I'm excited to be in conversation and learn from my fellow panelists.
Great. Well, I think a good place to start is just finding out from all of your perspectives what you think the key differences are between charity and solidarity when it comes to philanthropic giving, and what harm do you see potentially being reproduced or created with a charity mindset as opposed to a solidarity mindset. Caitlin, do you mind diving back in?
Yeah, of course. So key differences from my perspective kind of revolve around two kind of core things, and they're all intertwined, of course, but the top two things for me are trust and motivations of the giving. So trusting on the solidarity side, trusting that communities have and understand solutions to the issues that they're facing. Like, communities know what they need. And so providing resources and then kind of getting out of their way. So that trust piece. And then the second one, motivations. Like, what are the motivations to give? Is it the tax benefit? Are you wanting something in return? Is it a power move, or do you believe in what these folks are doing? And you want to help them achieve it. Kind of related to motivations, and then I'll pass it off to Rebecca or Alex. What are the expectations then after the gift? Do you like smaller organizations with limited resources, which are, as we know, often led by BIPOC folks, disabled folks, LGBTQ folks, might not be able to meet expectations of the donor, like maybe larger orgs that are white-led are able to. So is the donor putting a burden onto the organization after they give? What are those motivations and expectations? And I'll pass it on to Alex or Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree with all of that. I think one stark difference is that when you think charity, it feels very synonymous with the savior complex. And, philanthropy is based upon, doing good despite, the means by which that wealth was accumulated. And that's the foundation of it. And it perpetuates the haves and the have-nots. And ultimately the haves, drive that decision making. And, charity, I think, reinforces communities as charity cases. I think that there's this idea that communities lack something as opposed to being in celebration of, acknowledging, being in support of these communities, especially given the immense social capital that has come to serve as dividends taken from the wealth that was gained on the backs of a lot of these communities. And I think solidarity asks, who decides, right? Where does that decision-making power lie? It moves us in the direction of collective care of populations that have been historically excluded, making sure that there's like collective needs being met. Obviously, it's decentralizing power. But then, I think when we think of these models and we think of solidarity, I think that we have to also, while it's important to explore new models of engaging with society, I think it goes without saying, but should be reinforced that we still live in a very entrenched capitalistic society. And so I think it's important that while we also develop new models, we still work towards ways that we are carrying out equitable practices as much as possible and sort of scaling towards a different type of model. But I think either way, what has to be looked at and always scrutinized, no matter what the model is essentially the intersection of race and wealth.
Yeah, definitely agree with all that you both said. And I feel like trust was like a big one that came up for me when thinking about that. Yeah, trusting folks to know what the issue is and also have some ideas about how to solve it, but also trusting that like if people try one thing and it doesn't work, that doesn't mean that you should no longer receive that funding, that like trusting people to try things out. And so then like also like groups receiving funding, having that confidence that that you are able to experiment, that you don't just have to try one thing. And also just thinking about like with trust comes time. So without having just like this limit of like, here's some money and you need to do something in the next 7 months to like solve this problem, but rather like, you know, allowing people to be comfortable while approaching solving a problem, like so that they're not just like running to get something solved as quickly as possible, but like having the time to like and feeling like they have that time to think through something and a couple of different options, and like I said, even trying things. And then I'll just go off what Caitlin said with like the motivation. You know, with charity, I think the motivation a lot of times is going to be control. Like I'll give you a little bit of money, and if you act in the right way, then, you know, maybe I'll give you more. But if you don't, then that is going to end. And then also what Rebecca was saying, that like saviorism complex of like, that's, you know, exactly what that to me feels like what charity is built upon. Like I have decided that I will, you know, grant you with, or that I will like, you know, grant you with this resource. Whereas like with solidarity, I think the motivation is like, we have a problem and we need to solve this, and I have the access to resources, so that's going to be my contribution. You have the eyes on the ground, that's going to be your contribution. And that like we should both come out of this relationship with more equal footing. Yeah.
Totally. I wanted to add too, if I could, Lily, thinking about harms that are reproduced or perpetuated. There's a lot on the funder side, but I also wanted to like talk about on the development side, there are practices that we have that also perpetuate this kind of mindset in our relationship with donors. With this, you know, if you've ever gone to any type of professional development around fundraising, you know, it's very donor centric. It's all about, you know, saying you did this, you're a hero, thank you so much. And of course, we should be thanking donors, but to place them, it's almost othering, you know, the donor and placing this hierarchy on it. And so just wanted to shine some light that there are some things on the development side too that maybe need to shift in our relationship with donors. And I'll put a resource if you've heard of the community-centric fundraising model started partly by Voulet and partners of his. I'll drop that in the chat, but yeah, just think about the development side too.
Yeah, that makes me think that like an issue that charity perpetuates is an idea of two communities as opposed to one.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think particularly from the developmental side, that what has been on my mind is this idea that I would say that like organizations are sort of serving as a middleman, and you have funders or foundations on one side, community on the other, and we're almost a buffer. But that buffer is not designed to really be a true go-between between either side. It's really just to talk to the funders and sort of protect them from actually having to have any one-on-one true interaction with the people that they are claiming to be helping. It's a little different, I guess, in the art sphere sometimes because it's a patron potentially who's coming in into your building, into your show, into your facilities. But I think it's easier to think of it as a more direct service, like you are helping potentially someone with a direct service, like providing them shelter. Those people who need shelter aren't necessarily ever going to come into contact with the people who are funding that gift, as they want to think about it. It's a gift. It's not something that's like a right, if that makes sense. But yes, I agree with everything that you said. And I would love, I think, to move into this idea of, what is the structural change that has been pushed towards recently, particularly like in this last year, 2020 to 2021? What is this wave that you guys are sensing? And sort of how are organizations being forced to commit and actually follow through, and how does that connect with finances? I want to say that connected both as just an organization, potentially just organizing, because I don't think you have to be an institution to be organizing towards a social service or social change. But yeah, what are you seeing happening now? And let me know if that was too vague of a question. I can try to reframe it.
Yeah, was the
Could you?
question-
Oh, yeah. Could you reframe it if you don't mind?
Absolutely. So basically, I think we can all agree that there have been some massive, I guess, changes, both, I guess, on the ground, but also just in how we're thinking about how an organization has to commit and follow through and be held accountable to the community. And so I'm curious what you are seeing from your different perspectives and your different roles as how the cultural sector has been impacted by these last 2 years or so. And if that question doesn't elicit any big thoughts, I have plenty of other questions, so I can move on too.
Yeah, I guess like from my point of view, but like I don't work in admin or development. But from the point of view of like as like working as an organizer, I haven't felt a shift. I felt like I feel just as like with the things I feel frustrated about, I feel just as frustrated as before. But I know that like a lot of people were talking about over the last, or a lot of like organizations, and it seems like companies over the last year have been like, yeah, like, social justice is really important to us. And like, we're totally coming for this. Like, we're going to do this right. We promise. But from my point of view, I haven't seen follow through on that.
I think that I've seen a shift in funding, right, to start there. So obviously we know that shift has happened in terms of like supporting BIPOC communities and racial inequities, social justice. And there's also been if we're just talking about in general, a shift towards supporting direct services organizations that have been funding, folks on the ground who are working with the global pandemic and how it affects actually those communities. So that shift has happened in the way that a lot of corporate philanthropic programs, as with foundations, and even as with nonprofit organizations who shift their programmatic priorities, that shift has happened, right? Last year into this year. I think that I remain cautious though, in the way that we all do, right? I think that there's this wanting to know and this need of like, is there authenticity? Is there long-term commitment behind a lot of these? I know there were the statements, and we could talk about the symbolism and the empty symbolism, but at the end of the day, it's about changed behavior. And so I think in the immediacy of the pools of money that have shifted to those critical areas, as a fundraiser, it's great, right? It's actually great that money is actually being directed in that manner, that companies are committing 200 million over 5 years, 1 billion over 10 years, 5 million over 3 years. Like those things are actually happening, and that money is getting directed. So I think it's about this sort of cautious, awareness and looking for that change behavior, and holding companies, foundations, nonprofit organizations alike, who also pivot and shift with moments as well, to capitalize at times. I think it's about holding pairs, institutions accountable.
Do you see that move towards holding them accountable as moving us towards an actual solidarity economy, or is it this just for now what we need to do, and we can really culturally shift after that money has been moved a little bit? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I can't say, that's such a, I don't know what breadcrumbs this is leading toward, right? It can certainly be used as a tool when making the case for this, can certainly serve as a model for going towards solidarity economy. I think, again, going back to what I was saying in the previous question, I think that we have to almost look at things constantly with like a double conscious, right? There's like where we want to go. How do we scale there? Do we scale there quickly? Do we scale there strategically? Where are we right now? And what can that look like right now? So I don't know, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll be interested to see if this kind of results in any long-term behavioral change. There was a really big push to get money out the door very quickly to organizations, but I wonder if that's going to be, if longer-term commitments are going to be embedded into, funders' strategy. Because I think the pandemic really highlighted the precariousness of the cultural sector. I mean, with all the earned income that was lost, all of this, we don't have an endowment. Not everyone has an endowment. So I think hopefully this shifts into a longer term commitment. But also, if you think about like the history of philanthropy and the means by which Rebecca referenced earlier, like the means by which these folks came to their wealth, it's really not in the interest of the institution to provide what is actually needed to create systems change, because then they wouldn't need to exist, right? Their actions are, as I see it, self-preservation, really. So I'm also cautious to see if this will translate into, longer term support and strategy.
I would love to sort of shift, I think, a little bit more to the grassroots level. I'm curious how you see an organization relating to other grassroots, I guess, movements going on. Like, how how in moving towards a solidarity economy, how would an institution or an organization relate or communicate or work with, I guess, collaborate with people who are of the community, who are doing work that might be working sort of against the self-interests of those organizations? Because that's sort of how I see, if that can change and become a reality, that is really where I will feel we've made the most progress towards true solidarity. But I'm curious if you guys have seen instances of that being fruitful, or maybe it causing conflict. I just love to hear like what you can see out there in the world.
Just to clarify your question, are you asking relationship between philanthropic entities and grassroots organizations, or nonprofit cultural institutions and grassroots?
I would say it would be between the nonprofits, but obviously they are the ones who are receiving money. So from philanthropic arms. So with the money coming from, philanthropic arms, how does that work when potentially the community members are not are potentially completely running, I'd say, against the interests of philanthropists, because as you said, it is in their best, their best interest to not structurally change anything, because that is how their money comes to them and how they are able to give it out charitably.
Yeah, that question though, like how do nonprofits work with grassroots organizations? That question feels easier to answer than how do funders work with grassroots organizations. And I think it goes back to kind of like something Rebecca has referenced a couple times of like phases and like what we have now and then like scaling. Because I think like what I said about the difference between solidarity and charity being like, is it you and me or us? And I think it's easier, at least like with say like more like locally based nonprofits, to have that feeling of like us. And a lot of times like people that are working in the nonprofits are also like from the community that the nonprofit is serving. And so yeah, in that way, like the movement in solidarity would be pushing back on funders a little bit. And kind of saying like, well, actually, that's not what the needs are. And, having those conversations, because it's like, a big part is like having a relationship with your funder, right? And so using that relationship to, like, I think somebody said, I think it was you, Lillian, that said like nonprofits are there to like soften the blow a little bit, or like as a buffer. And so like acting as that buffer, but also like sanding yourself down as a buffer, being like, actually, like I'm here too, and this is what we need, and like if you want to be part of us, then this is where we go. I think that would be one way. And I mean, and I know that sounds like I thinking like actual ways, like pushing back, but then like what does some of that on the ground stuff look like? Like maybe it's approaching things like in a way that's like more like mini grants, like instead of like we fund programming, like we actually fund, we just move this money to grassroots organizations in like smaller amounts. So you're going to be, like, so the programming is, or what happens is going to be coming directly from them. Is maybe one thought.
Another thought that Alex just triggered for me is like participatory structuring of programs, trying to keep that constant feedback loop with folks you're trying to serve. Like, is this program really serving you? How can we make it better? So like constantly keeping that feedback loop of like, what do you actually need? What can we, as this middleman person, what can we do to make your work move forward? So keeping that feedback going and taking that input and actually changing your program if necessary, and being flexible that way.
Yeah, I think I think that that would absolutely be the ideal. It is difficult, I think, and this gets down to sort of where money comes from. Is if the money is coming from those funders and you try to put the pressure on them and they just pull the money, then you're kind of out of luck. And that's sort of, I think, the precarity of dealing with foundations and philanthropists who are not of the community, which is pretty common, I would say, or if they are of the community, they're just so far removed from the average person in the community that it's kind of difficult. And so I think something that I've been thinking about is how can we shift so that money speaks, but is the better idea to try to shift fundraising towards more of the the everyman and do more grassroots fundraising and try to move away from the the foundations and whatnot? Or do we really just need to, as middlemen, put our foot down and hope that the pressure is enough and we still get to keep the funding from both ends. And that's just something I'm curious about. I don't really have the answer, obviously, but Rebecca, do you have any thoughts on that as someone who feels sort of, I would say with corporation ends and such, that's sort of the bigger money?
Yeah, I mean, it's a interesting line that I toe on the daily, right? Fundraising from corporations, right? And so I'll start by saying what's so interesting, I think, in my world is that I think sometimes we forget that it's all, the individual that has a lot of money that gives probably made that money from that company that we're also fundraising from, and probably has the ability to start a foundation, right? So it's all interconnected to start. I mean, I think the struggle is in my opinion, and I think some of this has to do with a little bit with the trust-based philanthropy, right? Like if that were to get incorporated, I think oftentimes what shapes priorities for funders is like measurable degrees of impact, right? And so it's like a widely supported form of giving, and it's driven by metrics and it's driven by analytics, all these things that on the outset probably feels like it makes sense. But at times what we find is it feels like the funder is treating the gift like a stock investment or a business venture, right? And it's essentially saying that the funder knows best how to direct the resources. And it inherently starts the partnership off by saying the organization does not. I think if there was a collective push towards that idea and a collective acceptance towards that idea of trust philanthropy, which I think is one model that can sort of speak to, it doesn't quite speak to how do you deal with the conflict of grassroots organizations, the type of funding and this, but it does in the sense that trust-based philanthropy is essentially about saying, these are the resources and I'm going to step aside, right? Because I trust that you know what's best for your community, right? And so I think it would drive all the points home of what trust-based philanthropy would essentially do, right? Which is it would shift priorities to long-term, unrestricted. It's about the process. It's not about the end result. It's not about the differing priorities per se. And it becomes about, and listen, this sounds very ideal, but it then becomes about, well, it's about solving the challenges of solving societal problems, right? And less about everything else. And again, that also flies in the face of me saying, but we have to scale this, right? Like, how do you get from there to there? But you can still have an idea of where you would like that scale to go, right? And I think that trust, and also I don't always look at organization as like the middleman. I think organization can also, I think right now, because of what, the sort of reckoning, whatever you want to call it, of 2020, right? I think that a lot of organizations have, come under scrutiny, right? Highlighting, all these inequities. But I actually do believe at the heart, organization was always meant to act as grassroots, right? Like organization now might feel like a middleman, but I don't think it goes funder, organization, grassroots. I think that grassroots and organization are actually intertwined, and actually both are on this side collectively looking at a funder saying, hey, my org's ethos and values too might be in, be looked at conversely to yours, right? So I think it's a bit more fluid and certainly one could make the case that there are a lot of orgs that sort of act as just, we just process money in and process money out, right? But I choose to go back to what an organization, like a true organization with a mission statement, values, some sort of a grassroots zeal. I think that those two are very much intertwined, and both are on the same side of looking at, how can you have like ethical fundraising, or how can you work with a funder where your values clearly don't align. And also, lastly, I think it's also at the moment, it's two different conversations. It's two sides of the same coin, I should say, right? Because I think you can have a partnership with a corporation, for example, that where you've not compromised anything. And in fact, both objectives have been met, right? And you've left with more resources and you've made greater impact. But I think that the other conversation is, but was the compromise when you engaged in the relationship with the company? That's the part that we have to, right? How do you have that conversation? I mean, you can, but those are the sort of the two strands of thought there. I feel like I sort of went around the world, but.
No, that was good. It made me think, one thing that made me think about was like grassroots and organizations, and like how, and like, I agree with what you're saying, is like kind of over here, and it is kind of fluid and can be different. And so I started to try to think like, well, what is the difference between, like, why do we have two words for it then? Like, what's the difference between grassroots and an organization? And I think that when I think of grassroots, I think like we spend all of our time doing our mission. And when I think of organization, and what that fluidity is how much has your work become raising money? And so to me, it seems like the closer to grassroots is an organization that maybe like works on very low money and spends most of their time doing the work. And then the closer to that, like pure middleman, is an organization that mostly raises money and does little work, and like moves that money. So I don't know. So, and just thinking about the difference between charity and solidarity in my mind, like the closer you are to like doing the work, the more like in solidarity you are with like whoever else is involved in the work. And maybe like the more that managing money is focused, like the less solidarity there is. And so maybe part of the phasing is like merging those back together, or like bleeding them together, like in a good way, like the way paint colors would bleed together. Yeah, I don't know, that I wasn't trying to get to a certain point, but just something that I was thinking about while you were talking.
Yeah, I think, that goes back to the whole, prompt about trust-based philanthropy. And when I was thinking about, like, I was frustrated with the term, that we even needed that term in the first place, trust-based philanthropy, because that's what it should be all the time. Like, why do we need a separate term for it? And why isn't that like the bare minimum, for funders in the first place? I'm glad that it exists, but it frustrated me that like, why isn't that what we're already practicing? And now I'm forgetting where I was going with this. And with the principles of this trust-based philanthropy is kind of lessening that burden on organizations so they can focus more on what you were talking about, Alex, focusing more on the work. So reducing that proportion of time having to spend on fundraising, so the larger proportion can be spent on the work, right? And so I think, I hope funders adopting those principles of like, can we streamline this application? Can we just have a simple conversation? If we've been working together for a couple of years, why do I have to apply every year? All these things to reduce that burden on the organization so they can focus on what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and just one last thing was, Caitlin, kind of what you talked about before with like the sometimes like very donor-centric celebrations, and thinking about how that leans more towards charity, and just thinking that what kind of keeps coming up is that like the more we focus on money, the more we focus on the resource and the transfer of the resource, the more it feels like we're on charity. And the less we focus on the resource and focus on how we are using it, the more it seems like we're focusing on solidarity.
Well, it's about 45 minutes in, so I do want to take a moment and let people type in any questions that they might have or even unmute themselves and ask. So yeah, I'll maybe give a minute, and then in the meantime, I will line up some more questions if no one has any there.
In the meantime, I'm curious, can I ask Rebecca a question, Lily, while we're waiting?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Rebecca, what how you approach, because you mentioned, you know, the hesitation of even entering into a relationship with a corporation in the first place. I'm just curious how you approach that, like what questions or maybe what criteria are you looking at, or what questions you ask yourself before, you know, you agree to kind of enter into a relationship.
Mute. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, working in corporate fundraising is incredibly nuanced, and I'm sure we can say that about a lot of the areas of fundraising, but it's nuanced in the sense that you're not necessarily dealing with or interacting with, you know, a member or an individual patron or even a foundation who has historically loved that institution, loved the work, right? You're a lot of the times working with people who maybe have fleeting or passing interests. I think the constant for me in that, though, is I think a lot of the times funders will go into a meeting with corporate already in that sort of have not mode, right? It's a massive company. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to jeopardize the money. I'm probably also already a little wary of even being in the room, right? My approach is very much the opposite. And maybe this is just me, but I think at times organizations forget their own leverage, right? And maybe it's not forget, but maybe puts it to the side. I think sometimes we give up quicker before we're even asked to for that fair. So I enter a lot of these corporate spaces being very firm in the values of the institution, in the ethos, in the programming, in the outreach, right? I mean, a strategic partnership in the corporate world is as simple as it's two entities with objectives who want to leverage each other's assets, and in the case of philanthropy, to impact the greater good, right? And I have seen and conceived of partnerships where a partner has provided resources and stepped away because they go in having already trusted, coming into it already trusting what it is that you're capable of doing, right? And listen, it doesn't happen all the time, but absolutely there can be a model where you leave a room being like, oh, I actually compromised nothing, right? Again, it goes back to my previous one. I mean, you can then have the conversation of, but did you compromise by even entering into that, right? Into that partnership, even if that partner stepped back, if that were a partner that had, you know, like, I think it's just two lines of questions, but you know, to just sort of sum up, I think it's a very simple approach, which is I go in always with the institution in mind, and I'll take it even more personal. I go in as a Black fundraiser, right? I think, you know, when we think about authenticity of these funders, right? Some of the onus falls on the fundee, right? Like there has to be equity all around to champion equity, right? So if that's not your priority, you're not going to go to a funder with that priority, right? And so obviously I'm not going in saying these are my priorities, I represent the institution, but my lens is always an equitable lens because I'm a Black woman, right? So yeah, I think I just go in, you know, knowing what our values are and you know, knowing that the goal is to sort of not compromise anything, but how can we move forward together?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for answering that surprise pop question.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue with one that I was originally going to ask all the way at the end, but I think I'm just going to go for it. So it's the question of, how can, in what ways and how can philanthropic entities and the cultural sector actually work together? And I want to take this question a little further and ask, how specifically do you think that, tomorrow someone who's listening into this panel can say, okay, I want to try to attempt these 3 acts. They can be small, they can be big, they can be going and reading a book, I don't know, but just some really actionable steps that can bring philanthropic entities and the cultural sector together. And this would specifically be sort of in the idea of transitioning towards this solidarity that we've talked about, as opposed to charity, just so I'm clear. Moving towards that.
Just like one thing is like maybe fund something you wouldn't normally fund, just to like see what that feels like to yeah, that's my cat. Just to see what that feels like, to try to do it a different way would be like a good concrete first step that would show like a commitment to doing things differently.
I like that a lot. Something that I was thinking about for this question was bringing in, how do you think about how you traditionally make funding decisions and, kind of flip it on its head, or bring in folks from the community to help make decisions, not who's applying, but folks, who self-identify with whatever community you're trying to serve with your funds, and bring them in and have them help you direct where money is going.
Yeah, I would agree with that, of course. And I think, not to step in, but I think that there's also, trying to fund something new, but also funding a completely different type of giving. As in, I think that people are very comfortable giving to a donor advised fund, or giving it to not even a middleman, but something beyond a middleman, which and I think that asking people to instead just give to either a true grassroots movement, or even just, someone on the street, because people are so much more comfortable giving to, something that they consider has prestige, when that's not true. That is not true giving. That is, you probably, or you possibly do want something out of that relationship, or you just don't want to get your hands dirty. And I think that until people sort of shift that mindset, it's very hard to move towards the solidarity end and away from charity. Yeah, I guess the being able to see someone and actually like connect to them, as opposed to trying to go through side channels, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of these points, right? I think it's about the funder understanding that they're a part of something greater than themselves or their wealth, right? And I think it goes back to that sort of stepping aside. I say that a lot because that's something that, from a racial standpoint, that's actually something that's said a lot, right? And so, we're talking about economies here, but if you sort of look to the model of race, which is really the basis for all of this, it's really about stepping aside, right? I mean, to be frank, the phrase "believe Black women," right, is not just a phrase, it's not a tag, and it's as literal as it is metaphorical, right? And so the case to give to Black orgs, for example, arguably happened when slavery started, right? So it's like, what are we doing here? There just needs to, the minute you acknowledge history, the minute you acknowledge yourself, your wealth, your place in that, it's easier to sort of start to think about power. start to think about resources, start to think about what it means to give that up. Again, language that we use all the time when it comes to sort of racial inequality, right? It's the same concept, right? And again, it goes back to when I said, I think it's constantly scrutinizing the intersection of race and wealth. So as long as a funder, which, listen, that's clearly a lot to ask, because we, how much movement have we seen? But I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that of a funder. And so it's not so much I have a concrete step, I just think it's just food for thought, something to think about, right? I think the step that comes from that will be informed by, you sort of mulling that and thinking about that. And then steps will be driven from that.
I think a step that could come from that is just asking that every moment that you're thinking of something, whether it's class-based or race-based, is to think about it in framing it as a power question. Because I think that is sort of, like you said, I think a lot of it comes down to power, as opposed, and people sort of use different words to replace that because they feel uncomfortable with the idea that their position in the world just by default, with how history is played out, has more power as we are right now. And I think that confronting that is an important step. So maybe just next time someone steps into the room, you can frame it less as, I am a fundee and that is a funder, and start actually thinking about like, how are people positioned because of history with their power. So I don't know.
Agreed on that. And I appreciate the fact that it's also, while I think these points are driven towards funders, you're right in the sense that I think we can also just shape the room. Like a funder might not have that perspective. I think we can also shape the perspective, to your point, of how we even enter the room and even think about that situation. It goes back, Caitlin, to when I answered about how I enter rooms in corporate situations, right? It's, well, how am I framing this? Am I playing into and being complicit in this dynamic by already going and cowering because I'm the have-not, or I represent the have-not, or I represent that community? So agreed in terms of what are we doing and how are we looking at ourselves first, and not being complicit.
Well, I think that I am just going to open up the room to any last thoughts. If there's anything that you really didn't feel like you got to expand on, or you wanted to, share a little bit more about, the floor is open. Oh, I actually do see one question. Sorry, it popped up in the Q&A and I didn't see it. Okay. So someone asked, in some sense, it is in these companies' best interest to support social movements like Black Lives Matter and pledge some money because it gives them a seat in the conversation that they can, so that they can steer it away from potentially more radical demands and threaten the established order, basically. So how can we balance a need for resources with the necessity of not letting these demands get watered down and co-opted? That is a big question.
That's a really big question. And I'm not going to attempt to fully delve into that, but it's a great question. But what I will say is, I think that absolutely does exist. I think that's certainly safe to say that is a very valid point, and that certainly does exist. But I think that, it's that caution, right? It's not the, again, I don't know, because I stand here also, constantly wondering and constantly, again, going back to, is there authenticity? Am I even silly for even asking, is there authenticity behind this? Or is there long-term commitment, right? Like, am I naive in even requesting that, given the long and deep history of wealth, and a company can mean well, and there's still that fear of, yeah, are you actually trying to shift the conversation by sort of owning a massive stake in it? But I believe in the courage of one's convictions. I believe in sort of always scrutinizing, always. I think the answer to your question is, well, don't ever let up. I think to don't ever believe that that is the case, right? And I think it's up to you how you proceed. I think everybody has a different pathway. Some people are like, I don't even want to touch that or enter that space. I'm going to find the funds others. Some people are really great at saying, you know what, I am going to take this. I don't know what your intentions are, but you know what I can do? I can absolutely place this back into the community and make sure that I'm still, you know, protecting at all costs. You know, I just think that that is such, that goes back to how do we even, where do we start when it comes to structural inequity? Like, where do we start tipping the belt? Like, where do we even begin? Like, who even knows? I mean, it's a great question, but in the sense that that will be the ongoing question. That is the question du jour, you know? But I think it's just always remaining cautious. But also yourself as well. I think remaining, you know, just always constantly taking stock of, am I deferring back to my values? Am I deferring back to my values? I think it's also easy to get swept up into power, especially in being disenfranchised. It is very easy to sort of chase that. But I think it's just, you know, again, I can't fully tackle that, but I fully understand, William, where you're coming from with that. And I just think it's such an step-by-step thing.
Alex or Caitlin, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
That conversation just made me think about, like, and this was like asked earlier, is like maybe like what that first step is that like changes everything. Like, what's the first domino, or like what's the seed that then from here forth philanthropic giving looks different. And I just don't, I think I just agree kind of, and Rebecca kind of said this, but I don't think that it's going to just be one seed. I think it is going to be kind of chaotic, and like at some points it'll work really well and at other points it won't. And what everybody's role is different. Those who have more power, you know, have a harder role because like they have to like give that up. And I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not harder. But yeah, I don't want to say that's harder, but like they have to change a lot from where they're at now. And then like those of us that are like working in the nonprofit sector, I think, you know, we need to always be checking ourselves to act in solidarity when we take steps that are more towards charity, more towards like the flattery of the funder. And then I think that like those of us working in like the grassroots side of it, need to just kind of like what I think, yeah, Rebecca was also saying, like walk into a room kind of knowing where you stand. And I think, yeah, just like continuing to do that as well.
Yeah, I think the only thought that to add would be, you know, on the fundraising side, there's also like checking ourselves. Like I think you just said, Alex, like we have to check ourselves and also think about our values. And like it's hard, but we can also say no to taking money. Like if you see someone doesn't align with what you're trying to do, just, you know, don't accept that money. And that's really hard to say. I mean, that's coming from a privileged position, obviously, but you know, that's also an option. And then that signals to, you know, other funders that we need to make shifts and actually be in alignment with these values.
And also really just ultimately goes back to this question really just scratches hard at the fact of the structure of nonprofit. Again, not to sort of continue to say the same thing, is the ultimate problem is that we have to rely on, certain, and whether it be corporate, whether it be a foundation, whether it just be a really, really rich person. And it's not even justifying it. It's unfortunately, when you work in a nonprofit and you don't start the year like a corporation in the black, you start in the red, right? And so even the structure of how it's structured is you're constantly chasing money. And so in some respects, nonprofit can sometimes feel very corporate, right? Just the whole structure has to be, and I know that that's what this whole talk was centered around, but it does dovetail well with, well, yeah, I think it's not even so much of, how do you know which companies or their authenticity? It's how do we figure out a structure by which, that is not where the pool of funding has to come from in order to make impact, right? And so again, it goes back to imagining that and also trying to figure out to his point, but how do you manage that in the moment? So.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to end. Like I said, if you have any last thoughts, speak now or forever hold. But I want to thank you all so much for coming, and everyone for watching, and Peter and Amplify Arts for having us as per usual. And like Peter said, this will be up later, and so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I guess I will say good night.
Thanks, Lily, for corralling us.
I hope that my questions at least mostly made sense. Thank you for bearing with me. So have a good rest of your night, guys.